Duke Street was an exclusive enclave where the wealthy and mighty resided. Each house was a testament of status, massive gates, well-maintained lawns, towering fences, and security cameras at every corner. The residents lived with a constant need to outdo one another, and the street was alive with a subtle but intense competition among the women. And the street was alive with a subtle but intense competition among the women. Most of them stay-at-home moms, married to top executives, government officials, and business tycoons. Some had gotten there by pressuring their husbands to rent in the area just to keep up appearances. That morning, the sun was just beginning to warm the pavement stones of Duke Street. Grace and Chinyere, two of the street's residents, both stay-at-home moms, happened to find themselves outside, each dragging their bins to the curb for the trash collector. They had met there several times before, but the conversation today was different, filled with intrigue. "Have you noticed the house across the street?" Chinyere asked, blinking her eyes at the large, half-finished mansion that bloomed just opposite them. Grace was always quick with gossip, picked up immediately. "Of course I have. Who wouldn't notice? That building is coming up so fast. Honestly, it's been what? 3 months?" 3 months, Chinyere exclaimed in agreement. Who builds a house of this standard in just 3 months? The man must be rich, like really rich. Or maybe it's a government project. You know how these government officials are with their contracts. They have the connection to build fast. Grace laughed. "Government project, you see. I've been keeping an eye out, my dear. It's definitely not a government project. Too private. No logo. No workers hanging around unnecessarily. Everything is so smooth. It's almost like they don't want us to know who owns it. No. This is the work of someone really rich. Someone who wants to keep things quiet until it's all done." Chinyere, lowering her voice as though someone might be listening. "Whoever it is, they will definitely change the dynamics of the street. Can you imagine? All these women trying to keep up with the Joneses. This new neighbor will drive them mad." Grace smiled. "Oh, they're already on edge. Just yesterday, I saw Adanne, the one who claims her husband's into oil business, practically pacing outside her gates, as if waiting for some sort of news. You know she loves being the center of attention, always bragging about her new clothes, her husband's travels." Both women laughed as they walked slowly back towards their respective houses, their eyes still glued to the imposing structure. They could already imagine the stir it would cause once the house was complete. It wasn't long before the house in question was finished. And what a house it was. The exterior was a blend of modern elegance, with sharp edges and towering glass windows that gave off a sleek. The landscaping alone must have cost a fortune. Exotic flowers, trimmed hinges, and a driveway that could easily accommodate 10 cars. Every detail of the mansion screamed wealth, and the curiosity on Duke Street hit a fever pitch. It wasn't just the house that stirred the pot. Soon enough, the mystery was unveiled. The new owner was not just rich, he was extremely rich. He rode into Duke Street in a convoy of sleek black cars, each one more luxurious than the last. His arrival caused a small commotion, with the residents peeking out from their curtains trying to catch a glimpse. "He has a fleet of cars," Chinyere whispered to Grace one evening, as they both watched the spectacle from behind the safety of Chinyere's window blinds. "Look at them. Mercedes, Bentleys, Porsche, you name it. Some of us will have to save for months, if not years, to even afford the tires of those cars." Grace nodded. "And his wife? Do you know? They say she owns the biggest restaurant in the state." "Ah!" Chinyere gasped, almost dropping her cup of tea. The wife of the man owns the biggest restaurant in the whole state, on Duke Street. No wonder their house is like a palace. The arrival of the new neighbor sent shockwaves through the streets. The women, who had always been a subtle competition, now kicked things into overdrive. Suddenly, everyone was about showing off. Who had the most expensive car? Who threw the best parties? Who could get close to the neighbor's wife, who was now the ultimate trophy of Duke Street? Some of the women, like Adanne, became desperate to forge a friendship with the new neighbor's wife. Adanne, who had always prided herself on being at the top of the pecking order, began hosting lavish parties. She invited the new couple, hoping to rub shoulders with them, and by association, elevate her own status. Others followed suit, with every social gathering becoming a more grander and more elaborate affair than the previous. Those who were not as wealthy, who pressured their husbands into renting on Duke Street to maintain the appearance of wealth, struggled to keep up. Their husbands began to feel the strain, as they were forced to meet their wives' demand for new cars, designer outfits, and expensive home renovations, just to ensure they didn't fall behind in the never-ending competition. As the days went by, the women's conversation shifted. It was no longer just idle gossips about whose husband traveled where or who had the newest jewelry. It became a race to impress the new family. Who would be the first to become their friend? Who would be invited to their extravagant parties? Who will rise to the top of Duke Street social hierarchy? Grace and Chinyere, watching from the sidelines, couldn't help but be amused. Though they were part of the street social cycle, they always maintained a more reserved approach to the competition. They didn't need to show off as much, at least not until now. "Have you noticed how everyone's acting?" Chinyere asked one afternoon, leaning against the fence as she chatted with Grace. "They are all pretending to be rich, throwing parties left, right, and center, buying new cars, dressing up just to take out the trash. It's ridiculous." Grace smirked, folding her arms across her chest. "Oh, I've noticed. Even Nkechi, who used to claim she didn't care about all this social nonsense, is now wearing designer's clothes to the grocery store, all because of one rich family. And I heard that Danny's husband is furious. She's been pressuring him to buy her a new Range Rover so as to fit in with the new neighbor's wife." Grace shook her head. "It's a circuit. But the circuit was far from over, as the women of Duke Street continued to vie for the attention of the new family. A series of unexpected events began to unfold. Events that would shake the foundation of the carefully organized lives these women had built. These events began with Adanne's party. She had gone all out, determined to host the most extravagant event Duke Street had ever seen. Invitations were sent to every house on the street, with special attention given to the new neighbors. The party was to be held on a Saturday evening, complete with live entertainment, gourmet catering, and an open bar stocked with the finest wines and champagne. As the day of the party approached, the women buzzed with excitement and anticipation. Adanne had spared no expense, and everyone was eager to see how the event would play out. Chinyere and Grace had mixed feelings about the whole thing. You know, she's only doing this to impress the new neighbor, right? Chinyere asked, adjusting her dress as she prepared to head over to the party. She's practically begging for their approval. Chinyere sighed, slipping on her heels. Of course, but it's also an opportunity for us to see how everyone's reacting to the whole situation. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The two women arrived at Adanne's house to find that it was already packed with guests. The decorations were over the top, with strings of lights tinkling in every corner, and an expensive floral arrangement placed on every table. The live band played soft jazz in the background, and waiters circulated the rooms, offering trays of champagne. Adanne, dressed in a floor-length designer gown, floated through the crowd like royalty. Her smile wide, but her eyes constantly dating towards the entrance. She was waiting, hoping for the new neighbors to arrive. But as the night wore on and the party continued, it became clear that they weren't coming. Adanne's first smile began to waver as she kept glancing at the door, waiting for the new neighbors to walk in. The night was well on their way, and still there was no sign of them. She was certain that sending the invitation herself, along with a personal note, would have guaranteed their attendance. She had even gone as far as choosing a dress similar to one the new wife had been photographed in at an event. But now, as the band played its third set and guests filled their plates for the second time, it was becoming painfully clear they weren't coming. Across the room, Chinyere and Grace watched the scene unfold with quiet amusement. Look at her, Grace whispered, taking a sip of her champagne. She's practically dying inside. Serves her right, Chinyere replied, eyeing Adanne as she desperately tried to entertain her guest. All this money wasted, and the one person she wanted here isn't even going to show up. Grace smiled. I heard from Nkechi earlier that Adanne's husband was angry about how much she spent on this party. She's been trying to impress that woman for weeks, and now she's made a fool of herself. Chinyere laughed, but kept her voice low. Let her keep trying. She's bound to strip over herself eventually. But as the night wore on and the embarrassment became harder for Adanne to hide, something even more interesting happened. A hush suddenly fell over the crowd as the sound of engines filled the streets outside. Every head turned towards the window. Their curiosity arose. Chinyere and Grace exchanged glances, knowing that something significant was about to happen. Adanne, who had been forcing laughter with a group of guests near the bar, practically bolted to the door. The front gate opened slowly, revealing a sleek black Rolls Royce, followed by two equally luxurious cars. The cars drifted to a stop in front of Adanne's house, and the air was thick with anticipation. "It's them," Grace whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Chinyere nodded, her heart racing a little. It has to be. The driver of the Rolls Royce stepped out and walked around to open the back door. From the shadows of the car emerged the woman who had captivated the entire street, the wife of the man who owned the massive house opposite them. She was stunning, dressed in an understated yet elegant black cocktail dress, her composure confident. As she stepped into the driveway, the men and women of Duke Street stared at her. Behind her husband followed, tall, commanding, his presence alone sending a ripple through the crowd. He wore a tailored suit that seemed effortless yet screamed power. Together, they made an entrance that left every single guest at the party speechless. Adanne, for a moment, looked like she might faint. Her hands trembled as she watched and rushed to greet them. A huge smile plastered on her face. "Wow, welcome, welcome, oh my God. We didn't think you were coming," Adanne gushed, her words rushing out too quickly. "Please come in. Make yourselves at home. We are so honored to have you here." The new wife smiled politely, but there was a glint in her eyes, as if she knew exactly what kind of effect her presence had on the women of Duke Street. She moved through the crowd with ease, her husband close behind her. It was as if they commanded the room without trying. And in that moment, every other woman at the party felt overshadowed. Grace leaned towards Chinyere. "Look at the way everyone's scrambling. They are all trying so hard to be her friend." Chinyere nodded. "It's pathetic. They were all at each other's throats before this. And now, suddenly, they are acting like she's their new best friend." It didn't take long for the party to shift entirely. The conversations that had been going on between guests fell away as more and more people gathered around the new couple, eager to make an impression. Adanne, despite being the hostess, was suddenly out of the spotlight, left to hover awkwardly at the edge of the group as her guests frowned over the newcomers. The new neighbor's wife, whose name they finally learned was Amaka, engaged in small talk with other women. Her words measured and her smile pleasant. But it was clear that she was used to this, used to be the center of attention, used to people vying for her approval. The more she smiled, the more the women of Duke Street tried to impress her. "You know, Grace whispered, watching the scene with keen eyes. This is only going to get worse. Now that Amaka is here, these women will bend over backwards to impress her. Of course, Chinyere agreed. They are all dying to be her friend, hoping she will invite them to her house or recommend their husbands for a business deal. But mark my words, it will end badly for some of them. As if on cue, one of the other women at the party, Bimbo, stepped forward and offered a loud, overly enthusiastic greeting to Amaka. She was dressed in a tight sequins gown, her makeup done to perfection. Bimbo was one of the more competitive women on Duke Street, always eager to prove that she's better than the rest. She began regaling Amaka with tales of her husband's business ventures, trying to boast about her own wealth. Amaka listened politely, but gave nothing away, her expression calm and indifferent. When Bimbo finished her long-winded story, Amaka simply smiled and nodded, then turned to greet someone else. The subtle dismissal was like a slap in the face, and Bimbo's smile fluttered for just a moment before she quickly recovered. Chinyere raised an eyebrow. You see, it's already happening. These women are setting themselves up for failure. Amaka doesn't care about their petty competition. Grace smacked. She's not interested in being part of their little game. She's above it. But not everyone on Duke Street was as observant. Over the next few days, the race to win Amaka intensified. Nkechi, the once reserved neighbor, threw a lunch on and invited Amaka, only to be disappointed when Amaka politely declined, stating a prior commitment. Bimbo, still smarting from the perceived slight at that Danny's party, began hosting extravagant brunches, hoping to lure Amaka into her circle. She even convinced her husband to buy her a brand new luxury car, one that she would park conspicuously in front of her house. The tension on Duke Street grew thick as the women's attempt to impress Amaka became increasingly desperate. They pressured their husbands to buy more, to do more, to outshine the others. The appearance of wealth that some of them had built began to crack under the pressure, and soon whispers of financial trouble began to circulate. One evening, as Grace and Chinyere sat together on Chinyere's porch, watching the street from a distance, they couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. You know, Grace said, shaking her head, these women are going to destroy themselves, trying to keep up with Amaka. And she doesn't even care. Chinyere sighed, leaning back in her chair. You are right. But I have a feeling something bigger is coming. Something none of us expect. Grace frowned. What do you mean? Chinyere hesitated, glancing down the street towards the towering mansion where Amaka and her husband lived. There was something about them, something they both sensed from the moment they arrived. It wasn't just their wealth, it was the way they carried themselves, the way they seemed untouchable. I don't know, Chinyere said slowly, but I think we are about to find out who they really are. And when we do, is going to shake Duke Street to its core. The next few weeks on Duke Street were like a simmering pot on the verge of boiling over. The atmosphere grew tense as the women fought silently for Amaka's attention, while their husbands unknowingly became pawns to their wives' escalating attempts to outdo one another. Lavish brunches, new cars, extravagant clothes, anything to be seen as worthy of Amaka's friendship. But for all the effort they put in, Amaka remained silent and distant. She attended some of their events, offering polite conversation and warm smiles. But she never allowed herself to become too involved. She was cordial but exclusive, like a shivering prize just out for reach. And the more she kept her distance, the more desperate the women became. It wasn't long before the competition turned ugly. Bimbo, still licking her wounds from being dismissed at Adane's party, was determined to come out on top. She had spent a fortune on redecorating her home, had hosted 3 parties in 2 weeks, and had even suggested to her husband that they buy properties abroad, all to catch Amaka's eyes. But nothing seemed to work. And then one afternoon, something happened that changed everything. Chinyere was the first to notice it. She had been out on her porch, sipping tea, when she saw a black SUV pull up in front of Amaka's house. It wasn't unusual to see luxury cars coming and going, but something about this particular vehicle caught her attention. The windows were tinted darker than usual, and the man who stepped out was dressed in all black, his face hard and expressionless. He knocked on the door, and within minutes, Amaka appeared. She greeted the man with a handshake, and they exchanged a few words before she stepped inside and returned with a briefcase. The exchange was quick, too quick, and something about it felt off. Chinyere's curiosity was piqued, but she said nothing at the time. Later that evening, as she and Grace sat at her porch once again, Chinyere brought it up. "I saw something strange today," Chinyere began, her voice low. Grace looked up from her phone. "What do you mean?" "Amaka had a visitor, a man. I didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way they interacted. It felt secretive." Grace frowned. "A man? What do you think it's about?" "I don't know," Chinyere replied, her eyes narrowing. "But I have a feeling there's more to Amaka and her husband than we know." Grace leaned in closer. "You think something is going on?" Chinyere hesitated. "I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're hiding something." As the week passed, Chinyere's suspicion grew. She began noticing small, peculiar details. The frequent visits from strange men, the late-night deliveries, the way Amaka and her husband seemed to disappear for days at a time without anyone noticing. And all the while, the women of Duke Street continued their fruitless effort to impress Amaka, oblivious of the mysteries unfolding around them. It wasn't until one fateful evening that everything came to a head. Adane had decided to throw yet another party, her most lavish one yet. She had rented out a high-end event center in town and invited not only the women of Duke Street, but several prominent figures in society as well. It was to be the event of the season, and she was determined to make it a success. The night was going smoothly at first. Guests arrived, dressed in their finest attire, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Adane, dressed in a shimmering gold gown, floated around the room, basking in the glow of admiration from her guests. But as the night wore on, an unexpected guest arrived. A black SUV pulled up again, and out stepped 3 men, all in black. Their expressions tense, their movements deliberate. Chinyere, who had been standing near the entrance with Grace, felt her heart skip a beat. She watched as the men approached the door, and for a moment she considered leaving, but something told her to stay. The men strode into the event center, their appearance casting a budding chill over the room. Conversations quieted, and guests turned to stare as the trio made their way through the crowd. They stopped in front of Amaka, who was standing near the bar with her husband. "Mrs. Amaka Obiora?" one of the men asked, his voice low but commanding. Amaka's smile faded. She glanced at her husband, who stiffened beside her. "Yes," she replied cautiously. The man pulled out a badge from inside his coat. "We are with the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. We would like to ask you and your husband a few questions." A collective gasp swept through the room. The EFCC? Here? For Amaka? Adane, who had been watching from across the room, felt her legs go weak. This was not how she imagined the night going. Her perfect party was turning into a nightmare. Amaka and her husband exchanged a look, and for a moment, it seemed like they might resist. But then, Amaka sighed and nodded. "Of course," she said quietly. "We will cooperate." As the EFCC agents led Amaka and her husband out of the room, the guests erupted in a flurry of whispers. What was going on? Why were they being taken away by the EFCC? Grace and Chinyere exchanged a stunned glance. "I knew something was off about them," Chinyere muttered. "But I never imagined this." "What do you think they were involved in?" Grace asked. "I don't know," Chinyere replied. "But whatever it is big." The next morning, Duke Street was abuzed with rumors. Words had spread quickly about the EFCC's involvement, and the entire neighborhood was in shock. It turned out that Amaka and her husband were under investigation for money laundering and fraud, linked to several shady business deals that had been hidden behind the facade of their wealth. The luxurious cars, the massive houses, the fancy clothes, it had all been a front. The revelation sent shockwave through the community. Those who had once clamored for Amaka's attention now distanced themselves, eager to avoid being associated with the scandal. The once envied couple become outcasts overnight, and the women of Duke Street were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered illusions. Adane, who has spent months trying to impress Amaka, was devastated. All her efforts, all her money spent, had been for nothing. She had wanted so badly to be part of the elites, but now she realized that the very people she had admired were frauds. Bimbo too was left humiliated. She had gone into debt, trying to keep up with Amaka's lifestyle, and now she had nothing to show for it. Chinyere and Grace, on the other hand, watched the downfall with a mix of amusement and sadness. They had never fully bought into the charade, and now their instinct had been proven right. "Well," Chinyere said one afternoon as they sat on Chinyere's porch, "I guess that's the end of the housewife of Duke Street." Grace laughed. "I suppose it is. But I have a feeling something else will come along to stir things up." And she was right. Duke Street might have lost its queen Amaka, but the competition between the women continued. After all, in a place where appearances mattered more than anything, there was always someone new to impress, someone new to envy. The cycle never truly ended. This story teaches that living a life based on competition, appearances, and trying to impress others can lead to unnecessary stress, strain, and even personal ruin. We should learn to live on our own terms, in our own truth. Trying so hard to copy others can lead to disaster, because we may never know the source of their achievements.